Welcome everyone. Today we're talking about updates with COVID, and we have two of our physicians here, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Hori.
Yeah, my name is Mike Hori, and I am the Section Chief of the Infectious Disease Service here at Valley Medical Center, and I am also the co-chair of Infection Control, and I work with the pharmacy here too as well.
My name is Dr. Richard Wall, Medical Director of the Critical Care Unit and also pulmonologist here at Valley Medical Center.
Let's talk first about our timeline for expectations for how long we think this is going to go on. So do you anticipate how long the pandemic's going to go, and do you think we're going to have another surge? We've been hearing about there being a surge that's going to come this fall.
Well, I think the pandemic, unfortunately, is probably not going to go away anytime in the near future. I would anticipate another, perhaps another year, maybe two, of problems associated with us still having to think about, COVID being out there. Couple reasons. I think the first is that, there's ongoing transmission. With the current way that we're dealing with this problem here in the US, we are going to continue to have sort of low-level transmission from person to person of this disease. And unfortunately, we also have a fairly large well of people who are vulnerable to having more severe infections. And so when you have the disease still spreading and potentially going into that population, you're still going to have people who are going to get sick from it. We're still going to see it in our clinics, in our hospitals. And people still have to be concerned that that's what's going on. We do have to take into account the possibility of vaccination coming along. But I would say that although we would love to have something which we turn on like a light switch and just have it work, it really doesn't work like that. If you look at the way vaccinations really go, it takes time to perfect a vaccination. And it's not entirely clear that any vaccinations they come up with are going to necessarily be 100% effective. And it does take time, even though, we're having sort of an unprecedented situation with our vaccines in the sense that manufacturers are not only studying what vaccines are more effective, but they're also ramping up the potential for production. It's still going to be a little slow to be able to get the vaccines out there. Many groups are now anticipating sort of phased programs for bringing the vaccines into service, usually starting with healthcare providers, to try and protect them from the disease as well. So it's going to take time for the vaccine to get out there. And unfortunately, there are going to be those individuals who will not take the vaccine, despite the fact its availability, safety, and efficacy. So taking all that into account, I think we're just going to have to keep the idea that COVID is out there, that you could potentially get it at least for another 1 to 2 years before we start really catching up with vaccinations and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a while. As far as seasonality is concerned, the coronaviruses do have a seasonality. They tend to get worse in the winter. I think that, most experts are concerned about the potential possibility of a surge probably in November, if you look at it from a standpoint of the other coronaviruses, which COVID is related to. So, we are definitely here at Valley Medical Center, making sure that we have the capacity to be able to deal with this virus. We are also making sure that we're ramping up our testing capacity within our clinics to make sure that we can find patients as best we can. And we're also strongly recommending that people get flu shots during this particular period of time so that they can try and reduce the risk coming in with influenza and being mistaken for COVID and asked to, isolate for 14 days until we know a little bit more about where they're at. So, we are a little worried about that, and we're, really working at preparing for that, both here at the Valley Medical Center and throughout the University of Washington system, ramping up all of our abilities to be able to handle COVID disease as it comes on. So we were sort of hoping for a little bit of a break over the summer. We didn't actually get that. I think there's still questions about COVID and its behavior that we just haven't answered yet. So it's not 100% sure that that's going to happen. We do worry about it, though.
So what can you tell us about the vaccine coming online?
Well, I can tell you that it's actually multiple vaccines. As they say, they've put the A-team on the ice, and it's not just us, every country. Historically, coronavirus vaccine development has been very challenging. And that's why we don't talk about coronavirus vaccines normally like we do influenza vaccines. But it's amazing when you put everyone on the case. If anyone wants to sort of follow the latest, I'll direct you to the New York Times has a coronavirus vaccine tracker. So if you just Google New York Times coronavirus vaccine tracker, you can see the latest and what vaccine is at what stage of development. And so there are phase 1, 2, and 3 trials as of today. And again, this is changing and it's dynamic. Right now, there are 23 vaccines in phase 1. There are 14 in phase 2, and there are 9 vaccines in phase 3. That is the last phase. I mean, that's really amazing. And then there's all kinds of different styles of vaccines. Some use a protein from the vaccine. Some take the virus. Pardon me. Some use a protein from the virus. Some actually inactivate the virus. And so this website actually tells you a little bit about that as well. But the good news, there is a lot of development and it's occurring very quickly.
Just to kind of back up a little bit about the vaccine trials themselves, phase 1 and 2 studies decide whether the vaccine is safe and what the most reasonable dose is, and what is the chemical effect on people. Do they develop an antibody to the vaccine when they give it to them? So the vaccines that are safe, reasonably dosed, and develop antibody will go on to what they call phase 3. And that's where they take large groups of individuals. For instance, the two vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, which are out in phase 3 here in the US, are looking at enrolling 30,000 people each to be able to go ahead and decide whether these are safe and whether they will actually protect people from disease. Now, this is kind of time consuming. Right now, the last I heard, they figure they're going to have complete enrollment by the end of September. And I'm telling you this just because it gives you a sense of how likely these things are to be available soon. You have to be careful about who you enroll in these, because you have to get individuals who are potentially going to be exposed to disease so you can get some signal of protection, and people who have a variety of health conditions so that you can see how well it actually protects somebody from severe disease when they're likely to get that. So I think that's what's kind of slowing enrollment right down, is you have to pick your people fairly carefully for that. And then you follow along for several months to be able to see if this is actually safe and protective. The likelihood that we're going to have information enough to be able to certify a vaccine as useful will probably not be until Rick has his virtual Thanksgiving, I think, unfortunately. And whether we'll have a vaccine actually in production, I doubt that'll be the case much before 2021 at the rate we're going. Some of the strategies they're using are pretty novel and have not been proven in other viruses. So, I mean, what they're really trying to do in many cases is to hit a home run that, hasn't been done before. So I think vaccines are definitely, they're doing things like we've never seen before in terms of trying to ramp this up. I mentioned earlier that they're actually in parallel doing these studies, plus trying to ramp up their production if the vaccine proves effective. So they'll be ready right away to start pumping it out for the public. So that's something that's entirely novel. And I think that also is based a little bit on government funding for this. So I think they've been kind of wise in helping to fund some of these situations. But, we're still in the exploratory phase, and we still don't know, of all the vaccines that Rick was talking about, which ones are really going to work, which ones are going to be safe. Speaking of safety, I mean, we do have these large groups of individuals who are being tested. And we also have something called the VAERS program, which we use after the vaccine goes into market, where you can report adverse consequences of the vaccine. So once the vaccine actually is out on the market, we're still looking at safety issues. And I think it's important to realize that because, with every vaccine that we have, there are people who are concerned about the safety of the vaccine and whether they should get it or not. And I think it's important to be, to point out that if we follow the programs that we have outlined for previous vaccines, that what we try and produce is actually pretty safe, and that people can feel assured that they should get the vaccine if we have it.
And then there's just the obvious. Once you make a vaccine that you've proven works and is safe, you have to manufacture it and then you have to distribute it. I mean, making the vaccine is not putting it in somebody's arm. So that is probably another 3 or 4 month process to make 100 million vials in little glass bottles, ship them to the doctor's office.
Anybody who's trying to get a shingles vaccine will understand this.
So when you hear on the news that they've got a vaccine, you can add another 3 months until it hits your local area probably. And then there's the question of who gets it first. I mean, should we give it to healthcare workers first? Okay. Or should we give it to the vulnerable population? You know, the folks who are most likely to get complications, or how about maybe the people who are most likely to transmit it, the vectors, the 20-year-olds running around socializing. So, or is it first come, first serve? Because hey, it's, you know, it's a capitalist economy. So those questions have not been answered. And I think that's where good leadership will help us sort that out.
I kind of like Rick's idea about giving it to the vectors, because we actually have a demonstration of this. There's a pneumococcal vaccine that we now give to kids, which has been very effective in reducing disease in older people. So that might be a really good idea.
So when the pandemic first came on and we were concerned and all the hospitals were gearing up for a big surge of patients, and we did have a large number of patients who were going into the ICUs, unfortunately, but it seems like that's not happening quite as frequently. What has changed that fewer patients are going into the ICU?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pleased to say right now, at least locally and definitely at our hospital, our ICU numbers are very low. For the last few weeks, we're talking about 1 or 2 or 3 patients in a 30-bed ICU, which is great because we were pushing 2/3 of our ICU or more being COVID positive at the peak of this. First thing I'll just say about these patients is when they end up in the ICU, they take a long time to get better. This is not a quick illness. So if you end up on a ventilator, you're looking at 10, 12, 14 days on average to get off the ventilator. This is a lot longer than your traditional bacterial pneumonias and your other infections that cause sepsis and put you into respiratory failure. And we're seeing the same for the patients that don't end up on a ventilator but end up in the ICU. They have a very long, slow healing process. We're not exactly sure why it is, but it's something I'm sure to do with the immune system's inflammatory response to this virus. The numbers now are low, and I think there's a few reasons. One, and this is more of on a local level, there are parts of Washington that we're all aware of that are having outbreaks as we speak, but locally we're doing fairly well. I think masking is absolutely working. I hate masks. I will be the first to say it. I hate them, but they work. And I tell my patients that every time they come in. I sympathize with them that we're miserable wearing these things, but it's working. I know people firsthand, healthcare workers who've gotten it. They sat next to people for days on end, and the coworkers did not get it because the masks protected everyone. I think other things, social isolation, as we call it, or social distancing. I think the most vulnerable people are very careful about the social distancing. As we see in the news, the younger generation, you know, young people will be young people. And they are out there doing the social thing, and they're reaping the rewards, shall we say, of it. Fortunately, the vast majority of them are doing fine. Many of them are asymptomatic illnesses, but that doesn't mean they can't transmit it. But I think that their older generation, my 84-year-old mother, for example, that immune compromised patient of mine, they are being very careful about avoiding crowds and avoiding people. And so that is why we're not seeing the ICU numbers, because those are the people who end up in the ICU. It's not my 20-year-old niece and nephew who are going to end up in the ICU.
Right.
Okay.
I might add that, you know, our numbers in the state of Washington, at least in King County, they noted over the summer that 50% of the cases that they're beginning to see now are less than age 40. So the number of people who have got, or the people who've gotten the disease have definitely shifted to much younger. And our long-term care facilities, our nursing homes, our group homes, memory units and whatnot, have been a lot more aggressive about screening their own patients and staff to make sure that they're not bringing COVID in to cause sort of nursing home meltdowns. And that was certainly a feature of the early portion of this disease too, back in March and April. So I think that also accounts to some degree for our reduced numbers in the intensive care unit. And I also, you know, I just have to call out, you know, Rick and his team who've been working on this, that we're doing a little better job of taking care of people, both in the community and in the hospital. We've understood things about blood clotting, about oxygenation capacity and whatnot. So I think honestly that the patients we are bringing in the hospital are not progressing like they were previously. So we're doing a better job of taking care of them. Thanks, Rick, you and your crew.
No, thanks to my partners. I have to say, when we first heard about this illness coming out of Wuhan and it first arrived here, we were prepared for a 90% mortality rate because that's what they initially reported out of some of the ICUs. That is, we are nowhere near that. More than half are surviving this illness.
Right.
A lot more, probably three
Right.
quarters if you do it right, or more.
Should people still get tested for antibodies? And then also, what about immunity? If you've had COVID before, is there any indication that you might be immune to it?
The Infectious Disease Society of America, which I belong to proudly, has recently come out with recommendations with regard to antibody testing, and they recommended basically 3 different populations that we can go ahead and antibody test in. The first one is people who have puzzling situations. You know, their doctors see them and they think, this is COVID. You know, they've had exposure, they've got the symptoms, and yet for some reason or other, the testing that we typically use to prove the disease, something called PCR testing, is not coming up positive. And we would consider doing antibody testing in those individuals 3 to 4 weeks away from the onset of their symptoms to be able to bolster one way or the other whether those patients actually ever had COVID. To some degree, sometimes that's important for understanding exposure patterns within their family or within our hospital. So, you know, it is important to know if somebody looks like COVID, whether they really are. The second population of individuals that they recommend getting is kids, because kids get this funny inflammatory syndrome, which is called either, well, I can't remember, PIDS or MIS-C, that's the one I know, which is multi-system inflammatory syndrome of children. And that actually occurs typically well after the infection that children get. And it makes them very sick. It's similar to another disease that we've described in the past called Kawasaki's disease. And like Kawasaki's disease, it requires very special treatment, which actually is incredibly effective in terms of dealing with it. But to know that that's what you need to do, you have to make the diagnosis. And in that situation, doing antibody testing is a very important thing to do. The third thing that they recommended was in population studies, like for instance, looking at a hospital system like the University of Washington is to understand the way this virus transmits from group to group. You know, who is at risk, who's not at risk, where are we actually seeing disease occur? And you know, those are the 3 reasons why you would do antibody testing. And we would probably not recommend it under any circumstances, and that kind of any other circumstances, and that ties into your question about immunity. If you have had COVID disease, are you immune? I think the answer to that is 1, you probably are for a while. This looks at monkey studies, macaques they've done studies on, and 35 days after they were artificially infected, they did not respond to reinfection with having, you know, new systematic disease. So there was actually a study that was published out of Seattle looking at a boat crew where they went out to sea. I think there were 120 people on the boat. 3 people had previously had the disease and were proven to be antibody positive. And the rest of the people who went out on that boat were susceptible to disease. And then there were a couple of people who went on that boat who actually had active disease. Everybody in the boat who was susceptible got the disease. The 3 people who had previously had it did not. So that's a little bit of information that suggests that people are at least immune to it for a while. But we also know that for coronaviruses that are, again, related to COVID, immunity does not last long. And people are susceptible to infection within 1 or 2 years after a previous infection with the disease. And indeed, unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a couple of publications of people who actually have reinfected by COVID disease. They were able to do sophisticated studies to prove that the viruses that the patient had in March and the ones they had very recently were actually quite different. So they were reinfected. Now, there were 2 patients who so far described, one of which had less problems the second time around, which is kind of what we would expect, that you have immunity to some degree and it buffers the disease that you had. He was asymptomatic. But unfortunately, there's another patient who was in Nevada who actually had a worse case of the disease the second time. That's also theoretically possible. There are some diseases where if you have a little bit of immunity to it, it actually sets off the inflammatory response cascade more readily if you get it again. One example in the infectious disease world is dengue fever. And so, you know, having a little worse disease the second time around also is within the realm of possibility. So unfortunately, what we know now is that people can get it again, but we don't really understand how bad that's going to be when they happen. Which case scenario will be more common? The person who actually has a very blunted response to disease, who may actually be asymptomatic, or people who actually may have a little worse disease the second time around, we're not sure. Unfortunately, I think that this sort of information does suggest you can get it again, though, after a period of time. So to that effect, if you do a test and you show antibodies suggesting you've had it before, that does not at this time in any way suggest that you are not capable of getting sick again with the disease. And therefore, we would not recommend testing so that you feel like you're safe and that you can go out and go to COVID parties and stuff like that. No, don't do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering all of our questions. We appreciate your expertise and hope you have a good day.